47 people watched 3 men drag a widow through the dirt. Not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. Then 2 little girls stepped into the road. The older one was 9 years old and holding a knife, and she looked those men dead in the eye and said one word: "Stop." What happened next changed that town forever. But the real story is not the rescue. The real story is what that woman did after she stood back up. Lesson and meaning. This is a story about a woman the world threw away and the moment she decided to stop disappearing. It will remind you that you do not need permission to fight for your own life, that the people who drag you down do not get to decide how your story ends, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be helped and then turn around and help the next person standing where you stood. If this story hit you somewhere real, drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from. I want to see how far Lydia's story can travel. And if you know someone who needs to hear that they are worth fighting for, send this to them. Hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. We have more stories like this one, and they are only getting better. Lydia Hale counted exactly 47 people watching when 3 men dragged her down Main Street. She counted because there was nothing else left to do. The morning had started the way every morning started now, with heat, with hunger, and with the slow, grinding work of staying alive when the whole world had decided you did not deserve to be. She had woken before dawn in the narrow space between the back wall of the livery and the fence line where Carl Miner kept his hay. It was not a bed. It was not even a proper shelter. But the overhang of the livery roof kept the worst of the rain off her. And Carl did not check that side of the building before noon, so she had learned to be gone by then. She had rolled up the thin blanket she carried and tucked it behind a loose board in the fence. Then she had walked to the creek at the edge of town, moving carefully on feet that hurt with every step. The leather of her boots had split weeks ago. She had wrapped them with strips torn from her own petticoat, but the cloth was wearing through now and the blisters underneath wept against the rough fabric with each step. The creek was low. August had been brutal, even by Wyoming standards, and the water that usually ran clear and fast over the stones had thinned to a sluggish trickle, barely deep enough to wet her ankles. She knelt on the bank and dipped her hands in. The coolness was a mercy. She splashed her face, her neck, the insides of her wrists where the pulse beat close to the surface. For one breath she closed her eyes and let herself remember what it felt like to be clean. Then she picked up the bundle of soiled linens she had collected from the boarding house porch before dawn and began to scrub. Mrs. Carmichael had stopped paying her 3 weeks ago. Just stopped. No explanation, no apology. Lydia still came for the laundry because it gave her hands something to do and her legs somewhere to go. A reason to be vertical, as Samuel used to say. Samuel, who had been dead 2 years now, and whose voice she still heard in her head like a bell that would not stop ringing. She scrubbed and rinsed and wrung. Scrubbed and rinsed and wrung. The repetition steadied her the way it always did, giving her mind something to follow besides the slow circling of hunger and shame. Her knuckles cracked and bled where the lye soap had eaten through the skin, and she watched the thin threads of red swirl away in the current without feeling much of anything. She had gotten good at not feeling much of anything. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops and began hammering down on the town of Ember Crossing like a blacksmith working hot iron, Lydia had finished the washing and spread it on the grass to dry. She needed water for herself now, drinking water. The creek was too silty this far downstream, and the well in the town square required a penny she did not have. But there was a rain barrel behind Arnold Dutch's general store that collected runoff from the roof, and if she was quiet and quick, she could fill her canteen and be gone before anyone noticed. She was not quiet enough. Arnold Dutch stood at the mouth of the alley with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat pulled low against the glare. He was a big man, broad across the chest, with a face that had settled into a permanent expression of disapproval years ago and never found reason to change. "I told you about this barrel," he said. Lydia straightened slowly. "I will be done in a minute. That is what you said last week." Arnold stepped closer. His boots scraped against the packed dirt. "And the week before that. I am not bothering anyone. You are bothering me." He reached past her and gripped the edge of the barrel. His arms flexed. The barrel tipped. 3 gallons of water poured out onto the dust in a dark spreading stain that soaked into the earth and was gone in seconds. Lydia watched it disappear. She watched the dust drink every drop while her own throat ached with thirst. And she said nothing because there was nothing to say to a man who would pour water into dirt rather than let a woman drink it. Arnold wiped his hands on his trousers. "See that you find somewhere else." He walked back toward the street. Lydia stood in the alley with the empty barrel and the wet dirt and the sun pressing down on her shoulders like a hand trying to drive her into the ground. She picked up her canteen and walked back to the creek. They were waiting for her. Arnold Dutch, Carl Miner from the livery, a thick-necked man with hands like shovels, and a younger one, maybe 20, named Holt, with a patchy beard and a grin that sat wrong on his face. Too wide, too eager, the smile of someone looking forward to something ugly. "Told you she would be here," Arnold said. Lydia got to her feet slowly. The bundle of damp laundry sat at her feet. The creek whispered behind her. She measured the distance to the road, to the buildings, to anything that might count as help, and came up empty. "We have been talking," Arnold continued. "Folks in town, and we are all in agreement. You have overstayed your welcome. I have not done anything wrong." Holt laughed. "You exist. That is enough." Carl moved to her left, cutting off the path back toward town. "Come on now. Just pack up whatever you have and head out. There are other towns, other places for women like you." "Women like me," Lydia said quietly. "Widows with no family, no prospects." Arnold's mouth thinned into a line. "You are a drain on this town, and we are done carrying you. I have not asked anyone to carry me." "Then leave." "No." The word came out before she could catch it, small and hard as a stone. It sat between them, and nobody moved for a beat that stretched like wire. Then Arnold reached for her arm. She did not think. Her body moved on instinct, built from 2 years of learning which streets to avoid and which doorways to duck into, and how to make herself small enough to disappear. But this time, her body did not choose small. Her body chose fight. She bit Carl Miner's hand when he grabbed her wrist, bit down hard enough to feel the skin give, hard enough to taste the iron salt of his blood on her tongue. He yelped, and his grip loosened, and she wrenched her arm free and ran. 20 yards. She made it 20 yards before Holt caught her by the hair and yanked her backward off her feet. She hit the ground hard enough to drive the air out of her lungs, and the sky above her went white and silent for a long, terrible second. Then hands were on her, rough and impatient. They hauled her up and dragged her forward, and she twisted and kicked and tried to plant her heels in the dirt, but they were too strong and too determined, and she was too tired and too hungry, and her body had given everything it had in that 20-yard sprint, and had nothing left. They dragged her down Main Street. The dirt road was hard and rutted, and her feet scraped against stones that tore through the remnants of her boots. Her skirt ripped. Dust coated her face and filled her mouth with a taste like chalk and iron. She counted the faces, 47, men on porches, women in doorways, children watching from behind their mothers' skirts. 47 people who saw a woman being dragged through their town and did nothing, said nothing. Some looked away. That was worse than watching. Lydia stopped struggling. She knew this arithmetic. Resistance fed them. Silence starved them faster. So she went limp and let them drag her, and let them prove what they were in front of everyone who had elected to stand still and bear witness to nothing. And then a voice, small and sharp as a blade. "Stop." The men slowed. Lydia lifted her head. 2 girls stood in the middle of the road. The older one was maybe 9, thin and straight as a fence post, with dark braids pinned tight at the nape of her neck, and eyes the color of creek water in winter. The younger one was 7 at most, standing half a step behind her sister, with both hands balled into fists, and her chin up like she was daring the whole world to try something. The older girl was holding a paring knife, 3 inches of steel catching the August sun, and her hand was not shaking. "Move aside, girls," Arnold said. "No." The girl did not blink. "You are hurting her. We are removing a problem. She is not a problem. She is a person. The knife changed everything. Lydia could see it in the way the crowd shifted, the way Arnold's eyes went to the blade, and then to the girl's face, and found something there that scared him in a way that grown men could not. Because a child holding a weapon in the middle of Main Street meant something had broken in the order of things, and everyone standing on those porches knew it. And some of them knew they were part of the reason. Clara. A man's voice from behind the crowd. Low and tight, the voice of someone holding something back with both hands. June. The girls did not move. The crowd parted, and a man stepped into the road, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a face that had been weathered down to its essentials by wind and work, and years of carrying something heavy. He wore a plain shirt and trousers, both clean but faded, and his boots were scuffed at the toes. His hands were clenched at his sides so tight the knuckles had gone white, and when he spoke his voice was raw, not steady, not calm. Raw, like something had been scraped out of it. "Let her go. This is not your business, Crowley," Arnold said. "It is now." Ethan Crowley moved forward, and Lydia saw his hands trembling. Not from fear, she thought, from the effort of keeping them at his sides. She saw the muscles in his jaw locked tight enough to crack teeth. She saw a man who was holding back violence the way you hold back a horse that wants to bolt, with everything you have and the knowledge that if your grip slips for even a second, someone is going to get hurt. "She is not welcome here," Carl said, still nursing the hand Lydia had bitten. "Then she will come with us," Ethan said. Arnold blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Let her go." For a long moment, nobody moved. The sun bore down. The dust settled. Clara stood with her knife and her cold gray eyes and did not waver. Arnold released Lydia's arm. Not because he feared Ethan Crowley, because he feared the story. A child with a knife in the middle of Main Street that would be told and retold in every parlor and every saloon from here to Cheyenne. And in that story, Arnold Dutch would not be the civic leader protecting his town. He would be the man who made a 9-year-old girl pull a blade. Ethan looked at Lydia. His expression softened by a single degree, just enough to make room for a question. "Ma'am, would you like to come with us?" Lydia stared at him. At the girls. At the steady, impossible calm in his eyes that she now understood was not calm at all, but control. The hardest kind. The kind that cost you something every second you maintained it. She should say no. Should walk away from all of them and find another town and start the whole wretched process over again. Should save this man the trouble of being tied to her name. But the word that came out was yes. Ethan extended his hand. Lydia reached for it, and the instant her skin touched his, she felt it. A raised scar running from his wrist to his elbow, thick and ropey, the kind left by wire pulled tight enough to cut to the bone. She placed her hand in his, anyway. And they walked out of Ember Crossing together, Clara and June falling in step beside them, and 47 people watched them go in a silence so complete you could hear the creek dying at the edge of town. Ethan Crowley had sworn he would never bring another person to this cabin. That oath had lasted exactly 14 months. He walked ahead of Lydia on the trail, setting a pace slow enough for her ruined feet, but fast enough to put distance between them and town before anyone in Ember Crossing decided to grow a spine and come after them. Clara walked beside him, the paring knife back in her apron pocket, her face unreadable. June had taken Lydia's hand somewhere in the first mile and had not let go since, her small fingers wrapped around the woman's with the quiet ferocity of a child who had decided something and would not be talked out of it. He had not planned this. That was the thing that kept circling his mind like a hawk over a field, slow and relentless. He had gone to town for salt and flour. He had heard the commotion from inside the Mercantile 2 streets over, not Arnold's store. He would not set foot in Arnold's store. And by the time he reached Main Street, Clara and June had already positioned themselves in the road with the grim precision of soldiers taking a hill. He should have turned around, should have collected the girls and gone home and let the town do what the town was going to do. That was the smart play, the safe play, the play that kept the life he had built for Clara and June intact and unexamined. But then he had seen the woman on the ground, bleeding, silent. The way her body had gone limp, not in surrender, but in something worse. The practiced stillness of someone who had learned that fighting only extended the duration of the pain. He recognized that stillness. He had worn it himself in the workhouse in St. Louis, pressed flat against the floorboards while the foreman's belt came down, counting the strikes the way other boys counted sheep, waiting for it to end. He could not walk away from that. So now he had a woman following him through the pines toward a cabin that barely held 3. A woman whose name he had learned 20 minutes ago, and whose eyes held the kind of caution that came from years of expecting the worst and being proven right. A woman who had bitten a man hard enough to draw blood and run 20 yards before they caught her, and who had still somehow chosen to place her hand in his. The cabin appeared through the trees like a held breath. 2 rooms, a stone chimney, a porch that wrapped halfway around the front. He had built it himself 4 years ago, every board and beam, and it was the first thing in his life he had made rather than taken or broken. He loved it the way you love a thing that proves you are capable of something other than destruction. There were no mirrors inside. He had removed them all. Clara had asked once when she was 7 and still learning to braid her own hair. She had wanted a looking glass to check her work. Ethan had told her she did not need one, that her braids were fine, that vanity was a waste of time. All of which was true, and none of which was the reason. The reason was that he could not stand to see his own face, could not bear the eyes that looked back at him from any reflective surface, because those eyes belonged to a man who had done things that no amount of cabin building or child raising or quiet living in the pines would ever undo. He helped Lydia onto the porch and pointed to the wooden chair. "Sit." She sat. Her movements were careful, guarded, the way a stray dog moves when you offer it food, wanting to trust and unable to. Clara disappeared inside and came back with a tin cup of water. Lydia took it with hands that shook and drank. Her throat moved and her eyes closed, and Ethan looked away because the naked relief on her face was too close to something he understood. June stood nearby, watching Lydia with wide, serious eyes. The doll she usually carried was absent. She had left it at home that morning, a decision that struck Ethan now as significant, in a way he could not articulate. He knelt in front of Lydia and examined her feet. The makeshift bandages were soaked through with blood and dirt. Beneath them, the skin was a mess of blisters, some burst and weeping, some swollen tight with fluid. A few showed the angry red edges of infection. He frowned, but kept his face neutral, and went inside for the basin. His hands trembled when he unwrapped the cloth from her feet. Not from attraction, not from nervousness, from memory. Fire, a woman's voice, high and broken, the smell of pine sap burning like flesh. He blinked the images away and focused on the work. Clean water, clean cloths, the salve he made from rendered fat and lavender and beeswax. He worked carefully, methodically, and Lydia sat still and let him, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the tree line like she was calculating the distance. She was, he realized. She was measuring how far she would have to run if this turned out to be another trap. He set out supper, venison stew, thick with potatoes and wild onion. Clara ladled it into bowls. June poured water. The routine of the cabin, familiar and steady, swallowed one more person without apparent effort. But Ethan watched Lydia eat and saw it. She counted her spoonfuls. 7, 8, 9. She stopped at 10, looked up, scanned the table, checked the faces of everyone around her for signs of anger or disapproval. Found none. Took 2 more spoonfuls, stopped again. The behavior of someone who had learned that food could be taken away, that eating too much or too fast would be noticed and punished. He recognized it because he had done the same thing for 8 years in the workhouse, rationing his bites, hiding bread in his pockets, never taking more than exactly half of what was offered in case it was a test. He did not comment. He simply refilled her bowl when it was empty and set it in front of her and turned away before she could thank him, because thanks would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require a conversation he was not ready to have. After supper, after the girls were asleep in their narrow beds with patchwork quilts pulled to their chins, Ethan stepped outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. Old habit. The habit of a man who had spent years in places where letting your guard down meant waking up to trouble. He found the hoof prints at the tree line. Fresh. No more than a few hours old. Someone had followed them from town, staying just inside the trees, parallel to the trail. The horse had stood here for a while, shifting its weight, the prints deep and overlapping. Whoever it was had watched the cabin, then turned and left. Ethan crouched and studied the prints. The left rear shoe was missing a nail. The impression was distinctive, a slight drag to the stride where the loose shoe caught the dirt. He knew exactly which horse in Ember Crossing had that problem. It did not belong to Arnold Dutch. It belonged to Thomas Ridley, a man Ethan had not seen in 6 years, a man who knew every secret Ethan had buried, a man who, last Ethan heard, was supposed to be locked up in the territorial jail in Laramie. Supposed to be. Ethan covered the prints with his boot, stood slowly, and looked toward the dark mass of the trees where the trail disappeared into nothing. Then he went inside and sat in the chair by the door with his rifle across his knees and did not sleep. Lydia woke at 4 in the morning, checked the door 3 times, and discovered it had no lock. Ethan Crowley's cabin had never had a lock. That frightened her more than any bolt ever could. A locked door, she understood. A locked door had rules. You were either inside or outside, safe or not, welcome or unwelcome. But a door without a lock meant something else entirely. It meant trust or carelessness, or a man who believed he did not need barriers between himself and whatever came out of the dark. She lay still for a long moment, listening. Clara and June breathed softly in the beds beside hers, their rhythms slow and even. The fire had burned down to coals that ticked and glowed in the dark. From somewhere outside came the sound of an axe on wood, steady and rhythmic. And she realized Ethan was already up, already working, already building a wall of routine between himself and whatever he was carrying. She rose quietly, dressed in the dim light, and stepped outside. The morning was cool in the way that Wyoming mornings can be even in August, the night air still holding in the trees like a secret the sun had not yet found. Ethan was at the woodpile, his shirt dark with sweat despite the chill, his axe rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a man who had done this so many times. His body no longer required his mind's permission. He glanced at her when she appeared on the porch, but did not stop. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Coffee is on the stove." She went inside and poured herself a cup. It was strong enough to strip paint, dark and bitter and searingly hot, and it was the best thing she had tasted in months. She stood at the window and drank it and watched Ethan work and tried to figure out what the catch was. There was always a catch. She had learned this the way you learn to avoid a hot stove, through contact and consequence and the slow accumulation of burns. Samuel had been the exception, the one person who had given without taking, and Samuel was dead. And the world that remained was the one that had existed before him and would exist after. A world where nothing was free and kindness was just a down payment on obligation. So she went to work. She washed the dishes from last night, swept the floor, scrubbed the table until the grain of the wood showed through, found a basket of mending by the fireplace, and attacked it with a needle and thread she located in a tin on the shelf. Her stitches were neat and quick, and she moved through Ethan's shirts and the girls' stockings with the efficiency of a woman who had spent her life making things whole again. If she was useful, they would not throw her out. If her hands were busy, she did not have to think about where she was or how long it would last, or what she would owe at the end of it. By the time Clara woke, Lydia had reorganized half the pantry. Clara stood in the doorway and watched her for a long moment with those creekwater eyes that saw more than any child's eyes should. Then she said, "You are not our servant. Sit down." Lydia's hands stilled on a jar of preserved plums. "I am just helping. You are scrubbing like you think we will kick you out if you stop." Clara crossed to the table and sat. "We will not kick you out. He does not work that way. You do not know me." "No, but I know him." Clara tilted her head, studying Lydia with an expression far too old for her face. "He brought you here because it was the right thing to do, not because he wants something. Lydia set the jar down carefully. How do you know what he wants? Because we have been here a year, and he has never once asked us for anything except to wash our hands before supper. Clara's voice was matter-of-fact. If he wanted something, he would have asked by now. He is not a subtle man. Lydia sat, not because she was convinced, but because her legs had started shaking and she did not want Clara to see. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and let the warmth seep into her fingers, and tried to accept that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a table in the world where she was allowed to sit without earning it first. She failed, but she stayed sitting. And that was something. The morning passed in small domestic rhythms. Clara made oatmeal. June appeared from behind the curtain where Ethan slept, carrying a rag doll and wearing an expression of intense concentration. She sat at the table and began feeding invisible food to the doll with a spoon, narrating the meal in a whisper so soft the words blurred together into a single sound like water over stones. Ethan came inside, stacked wood by the fireplace, washed his hands in the basin, and ate his oatmeal standing up, leaning against the counter with his bowl in one hand and his eyes on the window. He had the look of a man listening for something. Lydia noticed. She filed it away. After breakfast, he went out again, this time with a trap line slung over his shoulder and his rifle in the crook of his arm. He told Clara to bolt the door. He looked at Lydia and said, "You need anything?" No. He hesitated as if there were something else he wanted to say. Then he nodded and walked into the trees and was gone. Lydia waited 15 minutes. Then she searched the cabin. She was not proud of it. But pride was a luxury she had abandoned along with her house and her name and her place in the world. And what she needed now was information. Not comfort, not reassurance, but hard facts about the man who had brought her here and what he might want from her and what she would have to give or do or become to survive the giving. She moved quickly and quietly, her hands practiced from 2 years of searching abandoned rooms and picking through discarded belongings for anything of value. She checked the shelves, the drawers, the space beneath Ethan's bed behind the curtain. She found what you would expect to find in a frontier cabin: tools, rope, extra ammunition, a Bible with the cover worn smooth and no name written inside. But she also found things that did not fit. A box of cartridges under the bed, far more than a man hunting rabbits and checking trap lines would need. Enough for a sustained fight. Enough for someone who expected trouble. A bundle of letters tied with twine, tucked behind a loose board in the wall above the bed. The envelopes were yellowed with age, and the return address was stamped in faded black ink. Union Pacific Railroad Company. She held the bundle in her hands and felt the weight of it and knew she should open them and read every word. She did not. She put them back. And in the bottom drawer of a small chest near the fireplace, she found a child's drawing folded into quarters. She unfolded it carefully. 2 tall figures and 2 small ones standing in front of a house with a chimney and a tree and a line of blue across the top that was meant to be sky. The kind of drawing every child makes, except that the house had been scribbled over in red pencil, hard and violent. The crayon pressed so deep it had torn through the paper in places. Someone had colored that house the color of fire. "You are looking for a reason to run, are you not?" Lydia spun. Clara stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her small face set in an expression that was not anger but something worse. Recognition. The recognition of a child who had watched adults leave before, who had learned to spot the signs, the restlessness, the searching, the careful inventory of exits. "I was just looking," Lydia said. "For what?" Lydia had no answer that would not be a lie, so she said nothing. Clara walked over and took the drawing from her hands. She looked at it for a long moment, then folded it back along its creases and replaced it in the drawer. "That is mine," she said, "from when I was small. I do not remember drawing it, but I remember the red." She closed the drawer. "I dream about fire sometimes." Lydia's chest tightened. "Clara, I am sorry. I should not have. It is all right." Clara looked at her with those gray eyes that held too much. "But if you are going to leave, do it now." Before June gets attached, she already likes you and she does not like many people. I do not know if I am leaving. Then figure it out. Clara's voice was steady, but beneath it was something fragile, something that would break if it was dropped. Because we have had people leave before, and every time it gets harder for her. And I am tired of watching her wait by the window for someone who is not coming back. She turned and walked outside, and Lydia stood alone in the cabin, with the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears, and the smell of cedar and wood smoke, and the faint, persistent ghost of something burned. That afternoon, Lydia took the laundry to the creek. She needed the air, and she needed the work, and she needed to be somewhere that did not smell like someone else's home. The creek ran clearer up here than it did near town, the water cold and fast over smooth stones, and the sound of it was a kind of mercy. She knelt on the bank and began to scrub. The rhythm came back, the old steady pattern, scrub and rinse and wring, and her hands moved without her mind's permission, and her mind was free to circle back to the letters stamped Union Pacific, and the drawing colored the color of fire, and the fact that Ethan Crowley, whatever else he was a man with secrets. She was so deep in thought that she did not see the snake. It was coiled beside the laundry basket, maybe 2 feet from her right knee. A prairie rattlesnake, thick as her wrist, its diamond-patterned skin blending almost perfectly with the stones and dry grass at the creek's edge. Its tail was up, and the rattle was going, a dry, buzzing sound that every person born west of the Missouri learned to fear before they learned to walk. Lydia froze. Not courage, not strategy, just the blank, overwhelming paralysis of a body that had absorbed so much fear over so many years that it had no more room for the adrenaline required to move. The snake rattled. The sound filled the world, and Lydia knelt there on the creek bank with her hands still in the water and her lungs locked tight and could not move. A rock sailed past the snake and hit the water with a sharp crack. The splash startled the snake. It uncoiled in a blur of scales and disappeared into the grass upstream. The rattle faded. The creek kept running. And Lydia drew a breath so sharp it hurt. June stood 10 feet behind her, another rock in her hand, her face calm and focused. "You have to yell," June said. Her voice was small but certain. "If you stay quiet, nobody knows you need help." Lydia stared at the girl. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. But June's words cut through the trembling and lodged somewhere deep, in a place where Lydia kept the things she could not afford to lose. "Thank you," Lydia whispered. June nodded, pocketed her extra rock, and sat down on the bank beside her. She did not ask if Lydia was all right. She just sat there, keeping watch, while Lydia's hands slowly stopped shaking and the creek ran on. That night, after supper, after the girls were asleep, Lydia sat on the porch steps and listened to the dark. The stars were enormous out here, scattered across the sky in patterns she did not know the names of. And the air smelled of pine sap and dust and distance. The wind shifted. She heard hoofbeats, distant, muffled by trees, but unmistakable. The rhythm of a horse moving at a walk, picking its way along a trail somewhere to the north. She looked at Ethan. He was standing in the doorway behind her, and he had heard them first. His hand was already on the rifle, leaning against the wall, and the look on his face was not the look of a man surprised. It was the look of a man who had been expecting something he hoped would never come. "Who is that?" Lydia asked. Ethan did not answer. He stepped past her onto the porch and stood listening until the hoofbeats faded into the distance. Then he said quietly, "Go inside. Bolt the door. Ethan, please." She went inside. She bolted the door, and she lay in the narrow bed, listening to Ethan pacing the perimeter of the cabin until the sky began to lighten in the east, and the pacing finally stopped. Ethan knew Thomas Ridley would come, not because anyone had warned him, but because 6 years ago Ethan had been the one who taught Ridley how to find widows worth squeezing. It had been part of the job. Railroad enforcement meant more than serving papers and looking threatening. It meant knowing who in a territory was vulnerable, who had property worth taking, who would fold under pressure, and who would fight. Ethan had been good at it. Better than good. He had a talent for reading people, for seeing the cracks in their composure, for knowing exactly which words would pry them open. And he had taught that talent to Ridley over campfires and card games during 3 years riding the same crew. Ridley had been a quick study. He had been too quick. He had taken what Ethan taught him and refined it into something personal, something that went beyond the railroad's interests and into territory that made even Ethan uncomfortable. But by then Ethan had other things on his conscience, larger and darker, and he had not had the standing to call anyone else to account. That was 6 years ago. Ethan had quit, had drifted west, had built a cabin, and found 2 girls in an orphanage and tried to construct a life that could bear the weight of what he carried. And for a while it had worked, the way a dam works, holding back pressure that builds and builds and builds until one crack appears and everything comes through at once. Ridley was the crack. He did not tell Lydia any of this. What he told her, over coffee on the morning of the 4th day, was the clean version, the version with the edges sanded down. "I worked for the railroad," he said. "Union Pacific, Enforcement Division." Lydia set down her cup. She did not speak. Not. Her silence was not the comfortable kind. It was the silence of someone who was listening very carefully and making calculations. My job was convincing settlers to move off land the railroad wanted. Sometimes that meant paying them fair price. Sometimes it meant telling them they did not have a choice. He stared into his coffee. "I quit because I could not stomach it anymore." Lydia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You threw people off their land." "Yes. And then you rescued me like that erases it." He had no answer. She was right, and they both knew it. A single act of decency did not balance a ledger full of harm. He had known that when he stepped into the road. He had done it anyway. Lydia stood and moved to the window, putting the width of the table between them. Her arms folded across her chest, her shoulders turned away. The warmth that had been building between them over the past few days, a fragile thing, barely visible, more suggestion than substance, went cold. They spent the rest of the morning in silence. Ethan checked his trap line. Lydia helped Clara with the mending. June played with her doll in the corner and pretended not to notice that the adults had stopped talking. Thomas Ridley rode into the clearing at noon. He came from the North Trail, which meant he had circled around from the direction Ethan had heard the hoofbeats, and his horse was the same raw-boned bay with the loose left rear shoe that Ethan had been tracking in his mind for days. Ridley himself had not changed much. Taller than Ethan remembered, or maybe just thinner, with a sharp face and eyes that moved too quickly, cataloging everything they touched. He wore a long black coat despite the heat, and sat his horse with the easy posture of a man who was used to arriving places where he was not welcome. Ethan stepped onto the porch. Lydia was inside with the girls. "Can I help you?" Ethan said. It was not a question. Ridley dismounted and smiled. The smile had no warmth in it. It was the smile of a card player showing you his hand after he has already taken your money. "Crowley." He said the name like it tasted good. "Ethan Crowley. Well, I will be damned. Last place I expected to find you." He looked at the cabin, at the garden, at the curtains in the windows. Playing house. That is a long way from the railroad crew. "What do you want, Ridley?" Ridley reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it up like a flag. "I am looking for a woman named Lydia Hale. Heard she might be staying out here. She owes a debt on her late husband's property. $300 plus interest." He smiled again. "I am here to collect." Through the window, Ethan could see Lydia watching. He could see Clara standing behind her, the paring knife already in her hand. He could see June in the corner, clutching her doll with both arms. "She does not owe you anything," Ethan said. "The contract says otherwise." "That contract is a forgery, and you know it." Ethan's voice was flat. "You have been running this game on widows for years. I know because I watched you learn it." Something shifted in Ridley's expression. The smile stayed, but the eyes went hard. You are going to want to be careful what you say next, Crowley. Ethan stepped off the porch. I said she does not owe you anything, and you are not taking anything from here. Get on your horse and ride out. Ridley held up both hands in mock surrender. Easy now. I did not come here for trouble. He let his gaze drift past Ethan to the window where Lydia stood. I came because I have a business proposition. Ethan said nothing. Ridley lowered his voice. I know your woman can keep books. I have heard she managed her husband's accounts, could read a ledger faster than most clerks in Cheyenne. And I have a situation that requires someone with exactly those skills. He tucked the forged debt document back into his coat. The debt is negotiable. All I need is her cooperation on a small matter of bookkeeping. No, you have not even heard the offer. I do not need to. She's not going anywhere with you. Ridley studied him for a long moment. Then something lit up behind his eyes, a recognition, a memory, and his smile changed, became something sharper, something cruel. Wait a minute, Ridley said. He looked at the cabin again, at the girls' faces in the window. Two of them, dark hair, gray eyes on the older one. I know those girls. He turned back to Ethan, and the cruelty in his smile widened. Those are the Brennan girls. James Brennan's daughters. Well, well, well. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not literally, but close enough. You mean to tell me, Ridley continued, that you are raising the orphan children of a family you helped destroy? He let out a low whistle. That is something. That is really something. Does anyone know? Do they know? Get on your horse, Ethan said. His voice had changed, gone quiet in a way that was more dangerous than shouting. Ridley mounted up. He gathered his reins and looked down at Ethan with the expression of a man who has just found a loaded gun lying in the road. I will give you a week, he said. Think about my offer. And he raised his voice just enough to carry through the window. Ask him about the Brennan family, sweetheart. Ask him how that house caught fire. He spurred the horse and was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the trees like a promise of return. Ethan stood in the clearing with his fists clenched and his heart slamming against his ribs and the taste of metal in his mouth. He turned and Lydia was on the porch. What did he mean, she said. The Brennan family. What did he mean about a fire? Ethan could not speak. The words he needed were locked behind a door he had spent 6 years building, a door made of silence and distance, and the careful daily work of pretending to be someone other than who he was. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Lydia's eyes narrowed. Ethan, what did he mean? He drove his fist into the porch post. The wood cracked, and his knuckles split and blood ran down his fingers, and he did not feel it. He turned and walked into the trees without a word, without looking back, without anything at all except the sound of his own breathing, harsh and ragged, and the knowledge that the dam he had built was breaking, and there was nothing on earth he could do to stop it. Behind him on the porch, Clara stepped into the light. Her face was white, her hands were still, and she said in a voice that was very small and very steady, Brennan. That was our name, before. Lydia looked at her. Our name before Mr. Crowley came for us, before the orphanage. Clara's voice did not waver. Our name was Brennan, and we lived in a house with a chimney and a tree in the yard. She paused. And one night, the house caught fire. Lydia knelt so she was at Clara's eye level. She took the girl's hands, which were cold despite the August heat. She held them and waited. Clara looked at her with gray eyes that held nothing childlike in them anymore, and asked, Miss Lydia, did Mr. Crowley have something to do with our house burning down? The first blizzard of the season arrived 3 weeks early, and Lydia found herself locked inside a cabin with a man she did not know whether to trust, 2 children who were terrified, and a question nobody had the courage to answer. October should have been mild. The old-timers in Ember Crossing always said the mountains held winter back until November at the earliest, sometimes December if the winds were kind. But this year, the winds were not kind. The storm came down from the high country on a Tuesday evening with a sound like a freight train, driving snow horizontally through the pines and dropping the temperature 40 degrees in 3 hours. By midnight, the clearing around the cabin was buried under 2 feet of white, and the trails were gone. They were sealed in. Ethan had come back from the trees the evening of Ridley's visit with his knuckles wrapped in a strip of his shirt, and his face set in an expression that Lydia had come to recognize as his version of pain. Not physical pain, the deeper kind, the kind that lived in the chest and radiated outward until it touched everything. He had sat at the table, and Clara had sat across from him, and June had climbed into Lydia's lap. And for a long time, nobody spoke. Then Clara said, "Tell me." And Ethan told her. All of it. The railroad, the enforcement work, the Brennan family, her family. How he had served the eviction papers to her father, James Brennan, on a Wednesday morning in April 6 years ago. How James had stood on the porch of the house with the chimney and the tree in the yard and told Ethan that he was not leaving, that this was his land, bought and paid for, and no railroad company was going to take it from him. How Ethan had ridden back to the camp and filed his report, and known, in the way you know the sun will rise, that the company had men who solved problems that legal channels could not. How he had known what would likely happen, and how he had said nothing. Warned no one. Gone to his tent and laid down and tried to sleep, and failed. The fire started after midnight. He had seen the glow from the camp 3 miles away. Had heard or imagined he heard the screaming. Had stood at the edge of the firelight and watched the orange smear on the horizon, and done nothing. James and Martha Brennan died in the fire. Clara and June were pulled through a window by a neighbor named Hutchins, who burned his hands so badly he never regained full use of them. The girls were sent to the orphanage in Cheyenne. Ethan quit the railroad the next morning, spent a year in whiskey and self-destruction. Then tracked down the girls and took them in. Not out of goodness, out of guilt. He did not say that last part. He did not have to. Clara listened without moving, without blinking, without crying. When Ethan finished, she stood up from the table, walked to the corner of the cabin, turned her back to him, and did not speak. She did not speak to him for 3 days. June did not fully understand what had been said. She knew something was wrong. She knew Clara was angry, and Mr. Crowley was sad, and Miss Lydia was very quiet, and the cabin felt different, smaller, as if the walls had moved inward by a few inches. She responded the way she always responded to things she could not comprehend. She stayed close to whoever seemed safest. For those 3 days, that person was Lydia. Ethan moved through the cabin like a man walking through deep water. Slow, deliberate, every action costing him more than it should. He stoked the fire. He cooked meals. He checked the supply shed through the driving snow. He did everything he had always done, with the same steady hands and the same careful attention, and the only difference was his eyes, which had gone flat and distant, like windows in an empty house. On the second day of the storm, Lydia watched him set a bowl of stew in front of Clara. Clara did not look at him, did not acknowledge the food, did not move. Ethan stood there for a moment, his hand still on the edge of the bowl, and something passed across his face that Lydia had never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, something worse. Acceptance. The look of a man who believed he deserved exactly this. He walked away and sat by the fire and stared at the flames, and Lydia understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was watching a man being punished by the person whose opinion mattered most to him, and that he would accept that punishment for as long as it was given without complaint or defense, because he believed, in the deepest part of himself, that it was earned. On the 3rd day, Ethan said to Lydia, "When the snow breaks, I will take you to town. I will not keep anyone here." She looked at him. He was standing by the window, backlit by the gray light of the storm, and he looked older than he had a week ago. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His shoulders, which had always been square and sure, had curved inward, as if the weight he carried had finally become visible. "I have not decided to leave," Lydia said. "You should." He did not look at her. "I am not the man you thought I was. I did not think you were any particular man. I thought you were someone who helped me when no one else would. That part is still true. The rest of it is also true. I know." Silence. The wind howled. Snow hissed against the windows. "Then what are you going to do?" he asked. "I am going to watch," Lydia said. "And then I am going to decide." She watched. For 2 more days, while the storm buried them deeper and the firewood dwindled and the walls pressed closer. She watched Ethan Crowley move through the space he had built for a family that now would not look at him. She watched him cook for Clara and set the plate in front of her and walk away without a word. She watched him tuck a blanket around June when she fell asleep on the floor and hover for just a second, his hand near the child's hair but not touching, as if he had lost the right to touch her. She watched Clara, too. The rigid back, the clenched jaw, the way the girl would not look at Ethan, even when he spoke directly to her. Lydia recognized that posture. She had worn it herself in the months after Samuel's death when the town began to turn on her, the posture of someone who has been betrayed by the person or the place they trusted most. On the 5th morning, Lydia sat down at the table with Clara and June and Ethan and said, "I'm staying." Clara looked up. "Because of them." Lydia nodded toward the girls. "Not because of you." She looked at Ethan. "Not yet." The "not yet" hung in the air between them. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not hope exactly. Something smaller. The faintest crack in the wall of acceptance he had built around himself, just wide enough for light to enter. He nodded. "All right." Clara said nothing. But that evening, for the first time in 3 days, she ate the food Ethan set in front of her. On the 5th morning of the storm, Lydia wiped the frost from the window and looked out into the white expanse of the clearing. The snow had stopped falling overnight, but the world was still buried, 3 feet deep in places. The trees bowed under the weight, the sky a flat gray sheet that promised more. And there, in the fresh, undisturbed surface of the snow, a line of boot prints led from the tree line to the supply shed and back again. They were not Ethan's. The supply shed had been broken into. Half the smoked venison was gone, along with the short-barreled Colt Ethan kept hidden beneath the floorboards. A gun only one other person on earth knew was there. Ethan stood in the shed with the cold biting through his shirt and the empty gun case in his hands, and the knowledge settling into him like lead in water. Ridley had been here. During the storm, in the dark, while Ethan sat by the fire holding himself together with willpower and routine, Thomas Ridley had walked through a blizzard to this shed and taken half their winter provisions and the one weapon Ethan had kept hidden for emergencies. The message was clear. "I can reach you. I know everything about this place, and you cannot stop me." A slip of paper was tucked into the empty gun case, folded once. Ethan opened it. The handwriting was neat and slanted, the hand of a man who had learned his letters late and took pride in the learning. "The widow's bookkeeping skills, or I tell every soul in Ember Crossing about the Brennan family. Your choice, Crowley." He folded the paper and put it in his pocket and went back to the cabin and said nothing. But Lydia saw his face when he came inside. She saw the way he checked the rifle by the door, the way he counted the ammunition on the shelf, the way his eyes moved to the window and stayed there. She had spent 2 years learning to read the small signals of danger, the tightened jaw, the careful hands, the silence that was different from ordinary silence, the silence that meant something was coming. And she read Ethan Crowley now the way she used to read Samuel's ledgers, with precision, with attention to what was written and what was missing. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing. Do not lie to me." He looked at her. For a moment she thought he would keep the wall up, keep doing what he always did, absorbing the problem, carrying the weight, managing the crisis alone. But something in her expression must have told him that she was done with walls, because he reached into his pocket and set the slip of paper on the table. Lydia read it. Then she went to the window and looked at the shed across the clearing and the boot prints leading away into the trees, and she was quiet for a long time. How much food did he take, she asked. Half the venison, some flour, a sack of cornmeal, and the gun. Ethan nodded. So we are short on food in the middle of a storm with no horse and a man out there who knows where we live and what we have and what you have done. That is the situation. Yes, that is the situation. Lydia turned from the window. Her face had changed. The caution was still there, the wariness, the armor she had built over 2 years of being treated as less than human. But underneath it, something harder had surfaced. Something that looked less like fear and more like arithmetic. She sat at the table and pulled the slip of paper toward her and studied it the way she had once studied columns of figures in Samuel's account book. With focus, with calculation. He needs me, she said. What? Ridley. He does not just want money from me. He wants my skills. He said so when he came here. He has a bookkeeping operation that is too complicated for him to manage, and he needs someone who can keep the numbers straight. She looked at Ethan. That means I have something he wants. That means I have leverage. Ethan stared at her. No. Listen to me. No. You are not going anywhere near Thomas Ridley. I am not asking your permission. The words landed like a slap. Ethan's jaw tightened. Lydia watched the control flaw surface, watched the mechanism that had been running his life since the Brennan fire kick into gear, the need to manage, to protect, to keep everyone inside the walls he had built, because inside the walls was the only place he could guarantee safety. I will handle Ridley, he said. How? You have no horse. You have no provisions. You are trapped in this cabin, the same as the rest of us. She kept her voice steady. How exactly are you going to handle him? I will figure it out. You mean you will go out there alone and do something violent, and either get yourself killed or get yourself locked up? And then what happens to Clara and June? The question hit him where she intended it to, right in the center of the guilt he carried. Are you protecting me or caging me? Lydia said. Because from where I'm standing it looks the same. He stood up from the table so fast the chair scraped across the floor, and Clara flinched in the corner. His hands were shaking. Not with fear, with the effort of keeping them at his sides when every instinct he had was telling him to take control, to fix this, to do what he had always done, and absorb the problem into himself and manage it alone, because that was the only way he knew to keep people safe. But keeping people safe by keeping them contained was not safety. It was captivity. And Lydia Hale had already spent 2 years in a cage built by a town that decided she did not deserve to be free. She did not flinch. She held his gaze and waited. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind drove snow against the cabin walls. Inside, Clara watched with her back against the wall, and June sat on the bed with her doll, and the fire crackled and popped and threw shadows across the ceiling. Then Ethan sat down. He put his hands flat on the table and stared at them and said, All right, what is your plan? Something eased in Lydia's chest. Not relief exactly, something closer to recognition. The recognition that this man, for all his flaws, was capable of something most people were not. He was capable of letting someone else lead. She laid it out. Ridley needed a bookkeeper for what she assumed was a land fraud operation. Forged deeds, inflated property values, double sales. The paper trail would be extensive, and Ridley could not manage it alone. If she pretended to cooperate, she could get close enough to see his actual records. Not the forged ones he showed to victims, but the real ledger, the one that tracked what he had actually done and to whom. That ledger, in the hands of a territorial judge, would be enough to put Thomas Ridley away for a very long time. But we have a deadline, Lydia said. The bridge into town. When the February thaw hits, the creek will flood and take the bridge. If we do not get to Judge Howren before that happens, we are stuck out here until spring and Ridley has all the time in the world." Ethan listened. He did not interrupt. When she was finished, he said, "It is a good plan, but if Ridley figures out what you are doing, he will kill you." "Maybe. That is not a good enough answer. It is the only one I have." They looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that was not romance, and was not alliance, but was something in between. A recognition that they were both damaged and both dangerous in their own ways, and that the combination of those damages might, just might, be enough to survive what was coming. Clara spoke from the corner. "If we are going to fight," she said, "we should eat first. We are running low and yelling uses calories." Lydia almost smiled. Almost. They rationed. It was not enough. Ethan began skipping meals immediately, giving his portions to the girls without comment, and Lydia caught him on the second day because she was watching for it. "If you starve to death," she told him, her voice low and sharp enough to cut, "who protects them? Your guilt is not more important than your life." He looked at her as if no one had ever said those words to him before, as if no one had ever suggested that his instinct for self-sacrifice was not noble, but destructive. He ate. That night, the wolves came closer than they had ever been. Lydia lay in her narrow bed, listening to the howls moving through the trees, circling, drawing nearer, and she felt Clara's paring knife under her pillow where she had placed it before lying down. The metal was cold against her fingertips. The weight of it was real, and she realized something that had been building for weeks, maybe longer. She was not frozen anymore. When the snake came at the creek, she had been paralyzed, locked in place by a body that had absorbed too much fear to produce any more. But now she was lying in the dark, gripping a blade and listening to wolves, and her heart was beating fast, but her mind was clear. She was not fleeing. She was not freezing. She was waiting, ready. Something had changed. She did not know what to call it yet, but it felt like the opposite of everything the town of Ember Crossing had tried to make her. The door opened and closed. Ethan had gone to check the horse. The hoofbeats, the restless stomping of an animal that smelled predators, had been growing louder. Minutes passed. Lydia heard something that was not wind and not wolves and not the normal settling of a cabin in winter. A sound that was wet and heavy and final. The door opened again. Ethan came inside, carrying the rifle in one hand. His coat was dark with blood. Not his. "The wolves?" Lydia asked. Ethan shook his head. His face was gray. "The horse. Wolves got the horse. 4 people. Middle of winter. No provisions, no mount. 12 miles to town through waist-deep snow." Lydia gripped the knife under her pillow and made her decision. "We walk," she said. 12 miles. That was the distance from the cabin to Ember Crossing. On a clear day with a good horse, half a morning's ride. On foot through snow that reached a grown man's thighs with 2 children and dwindling food, that distance could kill them. Lydia laid out the plan at the table before dawn. They would take what food remained, dress in every layer they owned, wrap their feet in canvas and their hands in rags, and walk south following the creek bed where the snow would be thinnest. She had memorized the contours of Ethan's map during the long weeks in the cabin, tracing the trails with her finger when no one was watching. She knew the landmarks. The split boulder at the 2-mile mark, the stand of cottonwoods at 5. The place where the trail crossed the creek on flat stones just north of where the road into town began. 12 miles. She figured 10 hours if they kept moving. Longer if the snow was deeper than she expected or if one of the girls could not keep up. Longer still if the weather turned. Ethan argued. "Too dangerous," he said. "See? The girls are too young. The cold could kill us before we make halfway." "Staying is dangerous too," Lydia answered. "At least on the road we are moving toward a solution instead of waiting for the problem to find us again." He looked at her for a long time. She could see the war happening behind his eyes. the instinct to control fighting with the recognition that she was right. He wanted to manage this, wanted to go alone, handle it himself, shield the girls and Lydia from the risk. But the horse was dead, and the food was running out, and Ridley was somewhere in those trees with a stolen gun and a head full of leverage, and the simple mathematics of survival did not leave room for noble solitude. "All right," he said, "we walk." They left at first light. The sky was clear for the first time in days, a pale, brittle blue that offered no warmth, and the cold was staggering. Lydia felt it in her teeth, in her sinuses, in the bones of her hands, despite the double layer of rags she had wrapped around them. Her breath came out in clouds that froze against her scarf. The snow crunched under her feet with a sound like breaking glass. She led. Ethan did not argue about this. She knew the route, and she had spent weeks studying the terrain, and she moved with a certainty that surprised even herself. One foot in front of the other. Follow the creek. Keep the sun on the left shoulder. Watch for the split boulder. Clara walked behind her, wrapped in every blanket and quilt they could spare, her thin legs pushing through snow that reached her waist in places. She did not complain. She set her jaw and followed Lydia's trail. And when the snow caught her and held her, she pulled free and kept going with the grim determination of a child who had survived worse than weather. June lasted 3 miles. She was smaller, and the snow was deeper for her, and despite Ethan carrying her on his back for the last mile, she was shivering violently by the time they reached the split boulder. Her lips had gone blue. Lydia called a halt and built a small fire from dead branches she broke from the underside of a fallen pine, using the flint and steel Ethan carried. They huddled around it and shared strips of dried venison, and Lydia rubbed June's hands between her own until the color came back. "Can she keep going?" Lydia asked Ethan. "She has to." They kept going. The landscape was brutal and beautiful in equal measure, the kind of country that killed you and then had the audacity to be gorgeous while it did it. The snow lay thick on every surface, bowing the trees into arches, filling the creek bed with a smooth white blanket that hid rocks and roots, and the thin crust of ice that formed over moving water. The sun threw diamonds across the snow, and the air was so clear you could see the Bighorn Mountains, 70 miles to the west, their peaks sharp against the sky like teeth. At the 5-mile mark, the Cottonwoods, the trail crossed a shallow tributary of the main creek. In summer, it was a trickle you could step over. In winter, frozen and covered with snow, it was invisible. Clara found it by falling through. One moment she was walking. The next moment the snow gave way beneath her and she dropped into 18 inches of ice water with a cry that cut through the silence like a rifle shot. She went into her waist, the cold hitting her so fast her body seized, and her eyes went wide and she could not move. Lydia was there in 3 seconds. She grabbed Clara under the arms and hauled her out of the water, both of them falling backward into the snow, and the cold was already working, already shutting Clara down. The girl's teeth chattered so hard Lydia could hear them from a foot away. Her skin had gone the color of tallow. Her body shook in violent waves that she could not control. Hypothermia. In this temperature, with wet clothing, Clara had maybe an hour before the shivering stopped. And when the shivering stopped, the dying started. Lydia did not think. She did not calculate or hesitate or wait for Ethan to take charge. She stripped off her own coat, the heavy wool coat that was the difference between cold and alive, and wrapped it around Clara. She ordered Ethan to build a fire, now, under that pine cluster, the biggest one, where the branches would break the wind. She broke limbs from the nearest tree and stacked them as a windbreak, while Ethan struck sparks into a nest of dried bark and blew them into flame with hands that shook not from cold but from fear. The fire caught. Clara was pulled close to it, wrapped in Lydia's coat and 2 blankets, her wet clothes stripped off and replaced with dry ones from the bottom of the pack that Ethan had kept waterproof. June pressed against her sister's side, adding her own small body heat, saying nothing, just holding on. Lydia crouched across the fire in her thin dress, arms wrapped around herself, shivering so hard her vision blurred. The cold was a living thing. It crawled into her from every direction, through the ground, through the air, through the wet patches on her dress where she had knelt in the snow. She felt her fingers going numb, felt her thoughts beginning to slow and soften at the edges. Ethan took off his own coat and put it around her shoulders. She tried to push it away. He held it there. "You saved her," he said quietly. "Now let me do this." She let him. Not because she was weak, but because she was wise enough to know that stubbornness in the face of hypothermia was not courage but stupidity. But she pulled the coat tight and leaned toward the fire and let the warmth claw its way back into her. Across the flames, Ethan watched her, and she saw something change in his face, something fundamental. The look of a man who had spent his whole life trying to protect people and who was seeing for the first time a woman who did not need his protection, who stood beside him, not behind him, who had taken off her own coat in a blizzard to save a child and had not waited for permission or instruction or help. He did not want to shield her anymore. He wanted to stand next to her. The difference was everything. Clara's shivering eased. Her color returned. Her eyes focused. She looked at Lydia across the fire, and something passed between them that was too deep and too raw for words. The understanding of a debt that could not be repaid and did not need to be because some things exist outside the economy of obligation. Then Clara reached out and grabbed Ethan's hand. "I am still mad at you," she said through chattering teeth. "But you are my pa." Ethan Crowley, who had not cried since he was 9 years old in the workhouse in St. Louis, who had buried every feeling beneath layers of control and routine and self-punishment thick enough to stop a bullet, sat in the snow beside a dying fire and let tears run down his face in silence. Not sobs, not drama, just water leaking from a crack in a dam that had held for 22 years. June reached over and wiped his cheek with her mitten. "It is okay," she whispered. "It is okay to be sad." Lydia watched this, and she made her decision. Not about whether to trust Ethan Crowley. She had made that decision days ago in the dark, listening to him pace the perimeter of a cabin that was falling apart. This decision was different. This decision was about whether to trust herself. She chose yes. They walked the last 7 miles as the sun dropped toward the mountains and the shadows stretched long and blue across the snow. Ethan carried June. Clara walked between Lydia and Ethan, one hand in each of theirs, and did not let go. Lydia's feet hurt. Her hands hurt. Everything hurt. But she kept walking because walking was what you did when the alternative was stopping. And stopping in this country meant dying. They reached the edge of Ember Crossing at dusk. 4 ragged figures stumbling through the snow on the road that led past the livery and the general store and the church with its whitewashed walls. They looked like ghosts. They looked like survivors. The first person to see them was Margaret Pruitt, standing on the boarding house porch with a shotgun in her hands. She had been waiting for someone, but it clearly was not them. Margaret Pruitt had been waiting for Thomas Ridley. She had been waiting because he had sent her a note of his own, different from Ethan's, but written in the same careful, slanted hand. "Deliver Lydia Hale, or I put a torch to your boarding house with everyone in it." She lowered the shotgun when she saw them. Her face, which had been tight with fear and resolve, crumbled into something Lydia had not expected. Relief. Margaret Pruitt, who had never spoken more than 10 words to Lydia in all the time she had lived in Ember Crossing, crossed the porch and came down the steps and put her arms around Lydia, and held on. "Thank God," she said. "Thank God. I thought he had already gotten to you." Lydia stood stiff in the embrace, her body unused to being touched with anything other than hostility. Then she let herself lean in, just slightly, just enough to feel the warmth of another human being who was not trying to hurt her. Just enough to remember what that felt like. Margaret brought them inside. The boarding house was modest but warm, with a fire burning in the main room and the smell of coffee and bread that made June whimper with hunger. Margaret fed them without questions, thick stew and cornbread and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she let them eat before she spoke. When the bowls were empty and the children were wrapped in blankets by the fire, Margaret sat across from Lydia and Ethan and told them everything. Ridley had been working Ember Crossing for months, quietly, methodically. He had found the pressure points of at least 4 people in town and had been squeezing them one by one. Margaret herself, Arnold Dutch, whose store sat on land he had acquired through a claim he knew was fraudulent. The widow Sarah Colvin, whose late husband had left debts she could not pay, and a rancher named Buckley who had been selling water rights he did not own. Each one had a secret. Each one had been paying Ridley or cooperating with his demands to keep that secret buried. And each one believed they were the only one. "He is not just a grifter," Margaret said. "He is a collector. He finds out what people are hiding and he uses it to control them, one at a time. So none of us know the others are in the same trap." Lydia looked at Ethan. She saw the understanding in his eyes, the same understanding that was forming in her own mind. Ridley's power was isolation. He kept his victims separate, ashamed, convinced that their individual secret was the only thing holding their life together. And as long as they stayed alone, he was right. But if you put them all in the same room, the secrets lost their power, because everyone would already know. "I have an idea," Lydia said. She laid it out the way she had once laid out Samuel's quarterly accounts, clear and precise and organized by line item. They would gather every person Ridley had blackmailed. They would go to Judge Howran together as a group, with combined testimony and the physical evidence of the blackmail notes, the forged debt documents, the threatening letters, the slip of paper from the gun case, strength in numbers, shame neutralized by shared exposure. Margaret listened. Then she said, "You know what this means for you." She looked at Ethan. "You will have to tell everyone. The railroad, the Brennan fire, all of it, in a courtroom, in front of the whole town." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." Lydia looked at him. "How long do you want that secret running your life?" He held her gaze. The answer was in his eyes before he spoke it. "Not any longer." The next day, Ethan did something Lydia did not expect. He walked into Arnold Dutch's general store. Arnold was behind the counter, weighing flour for a customer. He looked up when the bell over the door rang, and his face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: surprise, hostility, and then something harder to read, something that might have been guilt. "Get out," Arnold said. "I am not here to fight," Ethan said. "I am here because Thomas Ridley has been blackmailing you, and I know what he has on you, and I know you have been paying him to keep quiet." The customer, a woman Lydia did not recognize, grabbed her flour and left without a word. Arnold's jaw worked. "You do not know anything about me. I know your store sits on a claim you filed under your brother's name because you had already used yours. I know the original deed is in Ridley's possession. I know he has been charging you $50 a month to keep that information away from the land office." Arnold said nothing. His hands gripped the edge of the counter so hard the wood creaked. "I also know," Ethan continued, "that I am the one who served eviction papers to your cousin Daniel 8 years ago. I worked for the railroad. I did what they told me, and I have been carrying that weight the same way you have been carrying yours." The silence in the store was absolute. Arnold stared at Ethan with an expression that shifted from anger to recognition, to something Lydia had not seen on Arnold Dutch's face before: uncertainty. "What do you want?" Arnold said. "I want you to testify against Ridley. Come to the hearing with us. Tell the judge what he has been doing to you and to everyone else in this town." "Why should I?" "Because you cannot beat him alone, and neither can I. But together, we have a chance." Arnold shook his head. "No," he straightened behind the counter. "I will not stand up in front of this town and admit what I did." A voice came from the back room. "Arnold." Helen Dutch stepped through the curtain that separated the store from their living quarters. She was a small woman, thin, with hands that bore the permanent calluses of a life spent working. Lydia had never heard her speak in all her years in Ember Crossing. She had assumed Helen Dutch was simply quiet. She was not quiet. She had been waiting. "Sit down and listen to the man, Arnold," Helen said. Arnold opened his mouth, closed it. Helen looked at Ethan, then at Lydia, then back at her husband. You have been paying that man our money for 6 months. Money we need for stock. Money we need for the roof that leaks. And every time you come back from meeting him, you look like someone died. She folded her arms. I am done watching you carry this. Sit down. Listen. And then we are going to that hearing. Arnold sat. By the end of the day, 7 people had agreed to testify. Margaret, Arnold and Helen Dutch, Sarah Colvin, Buckley the rancher, a shopkeeper named Ellis, and Lydia and Ethan. Judge Howren was in town for the circuit court session. Margaret sent word. He scheduled the hearing for Monday morning. On Sunday night, Lydia stood at the boarding house window and watched the darkness. The town was quiet. Snow lay in patches along the rooftops and the boardwalks, slowly melting in the warming air. February was coming. The bridge would not last much longer. Then she saw it. A bloom of orange light at the edge of town. Small at first, then spreading, then leaping. Someone's hay barn was on fire. The flames climbed into the dark sky and threw dancing shadows across the snow, and the alarm went up and people ran toward it with buckets and blankets and shouts that carried through the cold air like gunshots. Ridley had started collecting on his threats. By morning, 3 of the 7 witnesses had changed their minds. The barn burned through the night. By dawn, Ember Crossing woke to the smell of smoke and fear, and 3 of the 7 witnesses had sent word through intermediaries that they would not be appearing at the hearing. Ellis the shopkeeper, Buckley the rancher, Sarah Colvin. That left 4. Lydia, Ethan, Margaret, and Arnold Dutch, who had not backed out only because Helen would not let him. Judge Howren's courtroom was the back room of the town hall, a drafty space with wooden benches and a desk hauled in for the occasion. The judge himself was a white-haired man with sharp eyes and a voice that could strip paint at 20 paces. He was not a kind man. He was not a fair man in the way that fairness is usually imagined, as a gentle thing that bends toward mercy. He was fair in the way that a blade is fair. It cut whatever was put in front of it without regard for sentiment. He looked at the 4 witnesses. He looked at the empty benches where the other 3 should have been, and he said, I need more than testimony. I need documentary evidence, paper, something I can hold in my hand and show a jury. Lydia stood. She had prepared for this. During the 2 days at Margaret's boarding house, she had organized every piece of evidence they possessed. The blackmail notes, the forged debt documents, the slip of paper from the gun case, Ridley's handwriting, consistent across all of them. The same careful slant, the same pressure, the same particular way he crossed his letter T with a long horizontal stroke that extended past the vertical. She laid them on the judge's desk. These notes were written by the same hand, she said. I have compared them against each other and against the forged contracts Ridley presented to me and to Mrs. Colvin and to Mr. Dutch. The handwriting is identical. Judge Howren examined them. He said nothing. Lydia continued. The forged debt contract Ridley presented to me claims to have been executed in Ember Crossing. But the paper stock is manufactured in Denver. She pointed to the watermark visible when the paper was held to the light. This is a Denver mill mark. You can see the date stamp in the lower left corner. This paper was not available in Wyoming territory at the time the contract claims to have been signed. The judge looked at her. How do you know about paper stock and mill marks? I kept my husband's books for 3 years. Every invoice, every receipt, every contract. You learn to notice the details when the details are what keep you fed. The room was silent. 20 people sat on those benches, neighbors and shopkeepers, and the merely curious, and they stared at Lydia Hale, the woman they had watched being dragged through their street 4 months ago without lifting a finger, and they saw someone they did not recognize. Not a victim, not a burden. A woman standing in front of a territorial judge presenting evidence with the calm precision of a professional accountant. She continued. She laid out the different ink types, the inconsistencies in the signatures, the fact that the witnesses listed on the forged contracts did not exist. She spoke for 20 minutes. And when she was finished, Judge Howard leaned back in his chair and looked at her, the way a man looks at a tool he did not know he needed. "That is compelling," he said. Then Ethan stood. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the room, at the faces he had avoided for years, at Arnold Dutch, whose cousin he had displaced, at Margaret, who had fed his girls when they first arrived in town, at Clara, sitting in the back row with June beside her, watching him with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "My name is Ethan Crowley," he said, "and I have something to confess." He told them everything: the railroad, the enforcement work, the families he had moved, the homes he had emptied, the lives he had disrupted in the name of corporate expansion. He told them about the Brennan family, about James and Martha, about the eviction papers and the fire and the 2 girls pulled from the wreckage. He told them that those 2 girls were sitting in the back of this courtroom. The room erupted. Arnold Dutch stood from his bench and his face was the color of old brick. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Brennan was my cousin. You are the one who ran him off." "I am," Ethan said. "Do you know what happened to him?" Arnold's voice shook. "He died in Colorado, broke and sick and 1,000 miles from everything he knew." "I did not know that," Ethan said. "I am sorry." Arnold sat. The anger did not leave his face, but it was joined by something else. The recognition that the man standing in front of the room had just done something Arnold himself had been unable to do. He had told the truth, in public, without trying to make it smaller than it was. Clara sat in the back row and held June's hand and watched Ethan with an expression that was neither forgiveness nor condemnation, but simply witness. She was there. She had heard. She would decide what it meant in her own time. The doors opened. Thomas Ridley walked into the hearing room like a man walking into his own parlor. He wore his long black coat and his boots were polished, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been in territorial courts before and had won. He scanned the room, saw the empty benches where 3 witnesses should have been, and smiled. The smile lasted until he reached the judge's desk and saw the papers spread across it. His own handwriting, his own forged documents, the mill marks and the ink analysis and the blackmail notes laid out in neat rows like evidence at a crime scene. Because that was what they were. His composure cracked, just for a moment, just at the eyes. Then he smoothed his coat and said, "I do not know what these people have told you, Judge, but I assure you this is a misunderstanding." "Sit down, Mr. Ridley," Judge Howard said. His voice was the kind of quiet that makes people listen harder. Ridley did not sit. He turned toward the door. Ethan was standing there. No weapon, just his body blocking the exit. 200 pounds of muscle and bone and 6 years of guilt standing between Thomas Ridley and the outside world. 2 men who had once ridden the same crew and eaten the same campfire meals and done the same ugly work, facing each other across a distance that was measured not in feet but in choices. "Move," Ridley said. "No." "You think you are better than me, Crowley?" Ridley's voice was low and hot. "We are the same, always were. You took people's land, I take their money. The only difference is you feel bad about it." "We were the same," Ethan said. "But I stopped." Ridley's hand went to his belt. "Not for a gun." Judge Howard forbade firearms in the hearing room, and the sheriff had checked at the door. But a knife was smaller than a gun and easier to hide. And Thomas Ridley had never been the kind of man who followed rules he did not agree with. The blade came out fast, and Ridley lunged, and the room erupted in screams and overturned benches. The knife caught Ethan in the left shoulder, driving deep into the muscle below the collarbone. Blood bloomed across his shirt instantly, spreading in a dark, wet stain that reached his belt before he even registered the pain. He did not fall. He grabbed Ridley's wrist with his right hand and held it, and they stood locked together for a moment that stretched like wire. Then Arnold Dutch hit Thomas Ridley in the jaw with a fist that had been clenching and unclenching on that bench for the past hour. Ridley went down. His head hit the floor with a sound like a stone dropped in a bucket. The sheriff was on him in seconds, iron cuffs snapping shut around his wrists with a sound that was final. Arnold stood over him, breathing hard, his eyes wide, his fist still clenched. Not a moral awakening, not a change of heart. Ridley had threatened his store and his livelihood and his family, and Arnold Dutch had spent his whole life protecting what was his. The right action from a selfish motive. And that was more honest than a saint's conversion. Ethan swayed. Lydia caught him. She pressed both hands against the wound, her fingers slippery with blood, and felt the heat of it pulsing against her palms. "Hold on," she said. "Look at me. Stay here." Clara ran down the aisle and dropped to her knees beside them. June followed, crying, her small hands reaching for Ethan's face. He looked at them, all three of them, and managed a smile that cost him everything he had. "I am all right," he said. Then his eyes rolled back and he slumped against Lydia, and the world narrowed to the feeling of his weight in her arms, and the sound of her own voice telling him to hold on. "Please hold on, you stubborn, impossible man. Hold on." Judge Howren banged his desk for order. The room quieted. The sheriff hauled Ridley to his feet. The judge looked at the evidence on his desk, and at the bleeding man on his floor, and at the woman holding him, and at the little girl with the gray eyes who was pressing her hands against a wound that would not stop seeping. "Thomas Ridley," Judge Howren said, "this court finds you guilty of fraud, extortion, forgery, and assault with intent to cause bodily harm. I am sentencing you to 12 years in the Wyoming Territorial Penitentiary in Laramie, to be served in full without possibility of early release. Sheriff, get him out of my courtroom." The sheriff and two deputies hauled Ridley to the door. He went without fighting now, the confidence gone, the polish stripped away, just a man in a black coat being dragged toward the rest of his life. At the threshold, he turned and looked at Lydia one last time. "You are better at this than I figured," he said. Lydia did not answer. She did not look up. She was busy keeping Ethan Crowley alive. Spring came to Ember Crossing the way an apology arrives. Slowly, hesitantly, unsure of its welcome. The snow retreated from the valley floor first, pulling back from the roads and the rooftops, in a slow, reluctant withdrawal that left behind mud and brown grass and the pale shoots of new growth pushing up through the wreckage of winter. The creek swelled with runoff, rushing loud and fast over its banks, and the bridge held, barely, but it held. And the road between town and the cabin to the north opened up again, the ruts filling with water and then drying in the March sun, and the world began to breathe. 3 months had passed since the hearing. 3 months since Thomas Ridley was led out of the town hall in chains and loaded onto a wagon bound for the Territorial Penitentiary in Laramie. 3 months since Ethan Crowley nearly bled to death on a courtroom floor, while a woman he had known for 4 months held his wound shut with her bare hands, his left shoulder healed, mostly. The knife had gone deep, cutting through muscle and nicking the bone beneath, and the doctor Margaret summoned from the next town over said it would never be quite right again. Ethan could move the arm, could lift it above his head if he had to, but the strength was gone. The smooth, easy power that had let him swing an axe and stack firewood, and haul water, and do all the 100 small tasks that frontier living required of a man's body was diminished on that side. Permanent, the real cost. He chopped wood one-handed now, slower, but steady. The rhythm was different, not the clean, double-armed swing he had used for years, but a careful, controlled motion that favored the right side and let the left rest. It took twice as long to fill the woodpile. He did not complain. Clara noticed. She started carrying wood inside without being asked, stacking it by the fireplace in neat rows the way Ethan had taught her. June helped, carrying one log at a time with both arms wrapped around it, her face set in concentration. They did not discuss it. They simply absorbed the new reality and adjusted the way families do. Clara had a conversation with Ethan in early March. They were sitting on the porch, just the two of them, watching the last of the snow melt from the clearing. Lydia was inside with June. The sun was warm on their faces and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. "I forgive you," Clara said. Ethan looked at her. He did not speak. "But I will not forget." Clara's eyes were steady. Her voice was steady. And I do not think you should forget either. I will not. Good. She was quiet for a moment. My mother's name was Martha. My father's name was James. They were good people. Yes, they were. I want you to say their names sometimes. I want you to remember them. Not just what happened, but who they were. Ethan swallowed. I will. Clara nodded. Then she leaned against him just slightly, her shoulder touching his. It was not a grand gesture. It was not forgiveness wrapped in a bow. It was a girl choosing the family she had, with full knowledge of its fractures, and deciding that the fractures did not have to mean the whole thing was broken. June called Ethan Pa for the first time 2 weeks later. She said it casually over breakfast, reaching for the bread and saying, "Pa, can you pass the butter?" And then she looked up and saw the expression on his face, and she grinned, wide and bright, and completely untroubled by the weight of the word she had just used. Because to June it was not a weight, it was simply a fact. Lydia did not move back to Ember Crossing. She did not need their acceptance, and she did not seek it. But she rode into town once a week on the new horse Ethan had bought in Laramie, a calm-tempered mare named Birch, and she bought supplies from Arnold Dutch's store and exchanged words with people on the boardwalk, and no one dragged her anywhere. No one whispered when she passed. Some of them nodded. Some of them looked away. A few, a very few, stopped to talk. Arnold Dutch was the most complicated. He nodded when Lydia entered his store. A single nod, curt, not friendly, but not hostile. The nod of a man who had done a difficult thing and was not sure yet what it had cost him. He never apologized for dragging Lydia through the street. She never asked him to. Some debts are not settled with words. Helen Dutch, on the other hand, always added an extra scoop of flour when she measured Lydia's order. She did not say anything about it. She did not need to. Margaret Pruitt became Lydia's friend. Not a charity case, not a guilty conscience trying to make amends. A genuine friend, the kind who showed up on Tuesday afternoons with a basket of eggs and stayed for coffee and talked about nothing and everything and the particular way that Wyoming wine could find the one gap in your coat and drive straight through it. Margaret taught Lydia to make preserves, and Lydia taught Margaret to keep accounts. And between them, they built the kind of bond that forms between women who have survived the same storm and come out the other side knowing that they are stronger for it. Lydia and Ethan did not rush. There was no need. The urgency of survival had passed, and what remained was the slow, patient work of learning another person, not the version they presented to the world, but the real one beneath, the one with the rough edges and the scars and the places that still hurt when the weather changed. They learned each other. Ethan learned that Lydia hated loud voices and needed silence in the mornings and could cook almost anything, but could not bake a biscuit to save her life. Lydia learned that Ethan's quiet was not coldness but processing, that he worked through his thoughts the way he worked through wood, slowly and thoroughly, and that interrupting him mid-thought was like pulling a nail from a board before it was set. They argued. About small things, mostly. Whose turn it was to haul water, whether Clara was old enough to go to the creek alone, the proper way to season a cast-iron skillet. Once about something large, about Lydia wanting to ride to town alone, and Ethan wanting to come with her, and the old pattern surfacing, his need to control, her refusal to be caged. And they had shouted at each other on the porch while Clara and June ate supper inside and pretended not to hear. They made up, not with grand gestures, but with the small, deliberate acts that mattered more. He built her a shelf for her sewing things. She mended the shirt he had torn during the argument, the stitches neat and tight and placed with care. They sat on the porch that evening with coffee and said nothing, and let the silence do the work. One evening in April, the air warm enough that the door stood open and the smell of new grass drifted in from the clearing, Ethan set down his coffee and looked at Lydia. She was sewing. The silver thimble he had bought her in Laramie caught the last light of the day, a small bright point on her finger. "If you want it," he said. "I would like this to be your home, not a place you are staying. Home, real and permanent." Lydia set down her sewing. She looked at him, this man with the scarred wrist and the wounded shoulder, and the eyes that had learned to look at her without flinching from what they saw. "What exactly are you saying?" she asked. "I am saying I want to grow old next to you, if you will have me." She was quiet for a long time. The light shifted. Clara turned a page of her book on the porch. June's wooden animals clicked against the railing as she arranged them in a line. A horse, a wolf, a rabbit. "I want that too," Lydia said. "But I need you to understand something." "All right. I am not staying because you saved me that day on Main Street. I am staying because I saved myself all winter long, and I am choosing to keep saving myself here with you." Ethan's smile was slow and imperfect, scarred at the edges, lined by weather and work, and the particular kind of pain that comes from living hard and choosing to live anyway. "That is more than enough," he said. He leaned over and kissed her. It was unhurried, certain. It tasted like strong coffee and cold air and the inside of a pine forest after rain. When she kissed him back, it felt like the first thing she had chosen purely for herself in years. Not survival, not obligation, not gratitude, just wanting, just reaching for something good and holding on. Clara glanced up from her book and rolled her eyes. Finally, she said. June looked up from her animals. "Does this mean she is staying?" "She is staying," Ethan said. "Good," June said. "I already moved her sewing basket to the good shelf." They sat together on the porch as the sun went down and the stars came out one by one, slow and certain, and the night folded around them like a quilt. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. The bread Lydia had baked that morning sat on the table next to a jar of Margaret's preserves. Clara's book lay open on the arm of the chair. June's wooden animals stood guard along the railing, and Ethan's axe leaned against the woodpile, the handle worn smooth by years of use, waiting for morning. And far away at the edge of Ember Crossing at Margaret Pruitt's boarding house, a stagecoach pulled up in the gathering dark. A young woman stepped down. She was holding a baby. Her dress was torn, and her eyes were hollow, and she had nothing in the world except the child in her arms, and the desperate hope that somewhere, someone, would not turn her away. Margaret Pruitt opened the door. The light from inside fell across the porch in a warm yellow rectangle. Margaret looked at the woman and the baby, and she did not ask questions. She did not make judgments. She did not calculate the cost. "Come inside, honey," Margaret said. "You are safe here." The woman stepped through the door. Margaret closed it behind her, and the light stayed on. Not every story ends with a rescue. Some end with a woman standing up on her own and then turning around to help the next one rise. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.